Morning. If I could have your attention, appreciate it. First of all, just by way of introduction, I know I'm kind of the new face around here, just approved by the board last night, probably over many objections, but I'm Sean Georges, the new executive director of the museum, and honored and humbled. Thank you. What a joy. Yeah, maybe I should stop. They say if you get applause, just stop. It's going to get worse. I have the honor, this is my first opportunity to introduce a speaker and to introduce a program, but I'm also always cognizant and honored by the fact that among us are military veterans and those who supported, family members who supported military veterans. Having spent 13 years in the Marine Corps, I can tell you how much I appreciate that kind of service. And so if we can give you a round of applause, I appreciate that. Wow. You've given us a legacy to try to follow, and that's what we think about every day. I also like to thank the volunteers and the staff at this location. If you knew how dedicated and committed these people are for the right reasons, well, I think you do know that, and you're here, so I'm glad you appreciate it. But maybe to them, thank you. So before we introduce the speaker, and I'm very excited, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Why don't we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I think that's still an important thing to do. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Everyone! I'll tell you what, I still get goosebumps. So I'd like to introduce this remarkable individual who happens to also be a volunteer here at Evansville Wartime Museum, Kevin Reid, one of those smart guys you like having around. Kevin has a master's degree in military history from Purdue University.
No others.
You boilers out there. While working on his degree, he specialized in weapons, tactics, and doctrines of the wars of the 20th century, so he's well capable of addressing us here today. He worked for almost 30 years with the Kentucky Community and Technical College System as an instructor of history and as a reference librarian. I've actually seen him with a book open in front of him. He is capable of doing that. I've observed that. He has written many articles and encyclopedia essays on military themes, such as military biographies, histories of battles and weapons, etc. Professor Reid has also been active as a reenactor for both World Wars, been a volunteer and a docent at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox. Can't wait to go there. The Indiana Military Museum in Vincennes, and of course, our museum, the Evansville Wartime Museum. So we are honored to hear him address the issue of bombers, air combat in World War II over Europe, and appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Give him a round of applause.
Well, I hope we keep
you entertained today. I was asked to talk about something dealing with our airplane here, the Hoosier Spirit 2, and that kind of leads into a rabbit hole of a lot of things you see on TV documentaries and so forth. What was the best fighter plane in World War II? So along the way, I thought, well, we can spend a lot of time talking about engine sizes, how many, cubic cc's are going into things, how many rounds are fired out of what gun, and what penetration. And at some point, I could put you all to sleep. I probably don't want to do that. So something that might be more useful is to talk a little bit about what we actually tried to accomplish in the air war over Europe and how that contributed to the Allied victory in World War II. Along the way, we're going to talk some about the bombers, we're going to talk some about the P-47s, and of course, everybody's overrated favorite P-51 Mustang. Now, I'm kind of giving the story away a little, I suspect. But I think you'll get an idea of why there is a difference between those two planes that everybody talks about. And hopefully you'll get a few ideas about how much they contributed to defeating Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and fascist Japan. So one of the starting points for me is we went down to the World War II Museum in New Orleans this spring. And we had a presentation given to us by one of their researchers. He said, one of the real myths out of World War II is that the only real airplane was the P-51 Mustang. And actually the P-47 did a lot of work, and it's kind of underrated, and that's not fair. So I made a couple of points I want to pass on as sort of an introduction. In the European theater of operations, of the top 10 American aces who flew combat during World War II, 9 of them flew in P-47s. Now, some of them flew occasionally in P-51s too, but 9 of them started out in P-47s and got most of their kills in the P-47s. That says something. Another thing in there that I kind of wanted to mention was sorties. And you're going to hear this word a couple of times, so I might as well mention it. Every time an airplane goes up into the air, it is considered to be a sortie. During World War II, P-47s flew, I love this number, 746,000 sorties. And the P-51s flew 238,000. Now, we started using the P-47s before the P-51s really got into action. That certainly is part of it. And by the time the P-51s came into action, a lot of the best German pilots had already been shot down, so the Luftwaffe was having a harder and harder time getting up there. But again, you get an idea of how prolific the use of the P-47 was. The final thing he talked about was during World War II in Europe, the P-47 shot down over 7,000 German airplanes. And the equivalent score for the P-51s was just over 3,000. So again, the P-47s did yeoman service throughout. And the final thing is a fairly famous quote. I can't trace it back to an individual, but you see it in a lot of books on the P-47 and on the air war. And that is, if you want to fly fancy and you want to shoot things down, P-51 is really good. If you want to fly home, fly in a P-47. And so that, I think, is a big part of the story, too, is that it was not just very capable, but also very strong and rugged. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about why that was the case. So, I guess the next question is, how do you decide what's the best? And it's kind of hard to do that these days in America because, well, we've got this wonderful sports culture. And everybody loves statistics. Who's got the best batting average? Who has the most passes completed? Who has the most rushing yards? Who has the most tackles? Who has the hit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes, if you read about airplanes in World War II, there's a whole lot of that goes into the books. And I guess one of the things, the other one I should mention, of course, is the goat. Everybody familiar with the term goat? It's big in the press these days, the greatest of all time. And so everybody has to have the one thing that's best. And I'll kind of tell the story away. It's not, there isn't any one best weapon in World War II. There isn't any one best group of guys. World War II was so big and so huge that it was a mass effort, and attrition really is one of the things that won the war. But if you're going to look at planes, you kind of have to look at some of the parameters. What is it that makes them good? So they look at speed, altitude of the airplane, that is, at what altitude it actually operated best, what kind of firepower it had, how maneuverable it was, how ergonomic it was. Did the pilots actually get in it and fly it, or do you have to be a really special pilot to be able to fly it well? How about ruggedness and endurance? What about the range, and what about reliability? So those are all things. So for example, I mentioned in the introduction that I work up at the Indiana Military Museum up in Vincennes. And the owner of that museum, Judge Osborne, and I were talking literally just yesterday. He had been talking to one of the higher ranking German aces in the 1960s. And the guy was talking about the Messerschmitt 109. He said, you guys kept building bigger bombers and more fighter planes, so we had to put more guns on our Messerschmitts. And then we had to put armor on the gas tanks so we didn't get shot down. And eventually, Messerschmitts got heavier and slower and harder to fly. Unless you're a really experienced pilot, you ended up having problems. And if you look at the statistics, over 20% of the destroyed German airplanes in World War II were destroyed on the ground by the aircrew. Because, it's really easy when you're taking off to get the mixture wrong and to plow into the airfield. So again, that sort of thing of ergonomics and flyability is really important. It's just really hard to quantify. And if we're going to stick with looking for the goat, we have to be able to quantify, and that's one of the problems we run into. And realistically speaking, while talking about the teams and so forth, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter who's the goat, it doesn't matter who has the best batting average. What wins is the team, right? It doesn't matter how good you are at shooting baskets, what matters is the team to get you to the point where you can throw the baskets. And it's the same thing with the airplanes. We don't have one airplane that wins the war. We have a mix of airplanes, which include short-range fighters, long-range fighters, bombers of various sizes and various ranges and so forth. And that's what ultimately won the war. So let's talk a little bit about what they were planning to do. And in order to understand that, we go back to World War I a little bit, because that's the introduction to air warfare. Now think about this for a moment, because we tend to get numbed by the speed of change. But the first flight of an airplane at Kitty Hawk was in 1903, and World War I starts in 1914, with airplanes that had literally lawnmowers for engines, and could make maybe 70, 80 miles an hour. And 4 years later, when the war was over, they had fighters, and they had bombers, they had strategic bombers, they had planes that had armor in them, and they had fighter planes that could go up to 150, 160, 170 miles an hour, mounting multiple machine guns. So you can see the speed and pace of change. And unfortunately, especially in World War I, a lot of these things were being introduced before anybody really had an idea of what they were supposed to do. So I think kind of introduction is, after the war was over, what were the, my own notes are here. What was the planning for future war going to be, especially what was that going to be in the United States? And I guess I should talk just briefly about the United States in World War I. Because we didn't enter until the very tail end of the war, we weren't necessarily prepared for it. In particular, the government under Wilson did not want to start a preparedness campaign because it would look like we were trying to get into a war. And you don't want to do that because people didn't necessarily want to get into the war. So even though, for example, since the airplane was invented in America, you'd think we'd have some of the best airplanes, but since we weren't flying into combat, we weren't actually designing fighter planes and bomber planes. So when our troops went overseas, they actually had to fly in British and French airplanes. Now, also, who controls airplanes? These are brand new technology, right? So in World War I, the airplanes were flown by the, let me get my terminology right so I say it properly, the aero section of the signal corps. Because the idea was airplanes would be used initially as scout planes or as observation planes. They would fly over the front lines and see where the enemy was. And if you had a big enough airplane that could carry two people, one would have a camera, and you could take photographs of the enemy lines. Then you could fly home, develop the film, and then send off information to the intelligence officers, and they could make a map of where the enemy lines were, so they could know where they're doing their expansion, where they put their artillery batteries and things like that, and then you could plan on how to defeat them. Not sort of a, on time sort of thing here. So it's kind of a slow process. As the Allies started doing, or the Allies and the Germans started doing that early in the war, they also started deciding, well, it's not very useful if the enemy can see our trenches and we can't see theirs, so let's shoot down their airplanes. And the first pilots that tried to do it with shotguns and pistols, and that didn't work very well. So eventually they mount machine guns, and then you have to figure out how to mount a machine gun so it doesn't cut off the propeller on the airplane, because that'd be kind of a problem. And so there's all kinds of technology that goes into building World War I airplanes. When the war was over, there were a lot of people that looked at the airplanes, and those are the people that are kind of referred to now as the air prophets. And there's a whole bunch of them. I'm going to mention 2. I could come up with a list of 20 probably. But the most important name you're going to see if you read about aerial warfare is an Italian general whose last name is WWII, D-O-U-H-E-T. And he looked at what happened in World War I and he says, well, you got our trenches and their trenches, and we keep fighting back and forth, trying to get across the space in between what we call no man's land. And we have these battles where thousands upon thousands of troops are shot to pieces or blown to pieces by the artillery. You know, if we had airplanes, we could fly over all of that and ignore all of that, and just fly over the enemy countries and force the enemy to surrender. Well, the enemy isn't going to surrender if you just fly overhead. We're going to have to do something. So we're going to need to build bombers to drop bombs on the enemy. And then what we're going to do is we're going to fly over the enemy cities, what we call the vital centers. That's where the factories are, and that's where the government is, that's where the taxpayers are, that's where the tax collectors are. And if we blow the heck out of the enemy's cities, then the people will be so distressed that they'll tell their government, stop fighting and go into war. And according to WWII, it would be so simple. All you have to do is have the biggest fleet of airplanes with the longest range. They fly over, they bomb the bad guys. The bad guys go, uh-oh, we gotta stop, and then the war will be over. In America, the guy that followed the ideas of WWII, I'm sure many of you have heard of, was a man by the name of Billy Mitchell. He had actually commanded American aircraft during World War I, and he came back having read WWII's ideas and published some of his own, and his idea was 2 things. First of all, you have to bomb the vital centers, just like WWII says. The other thing is, you build big bombers, and the bombers will always get through. Because the bombers have more engines, so that they can be bigger, and they can be heavier, they can carry bomb loads. And the fighter planes are kind of wimpy, they're not that fast or anything else, and will always be able to get over the cities. And gee whiz, since there's economic times that are getting a little hard anyway, because everybody wants to say now the wars are over, we don't want to spend on defense. Let's just spend all of our money on the Air Force, because it can fly over the armies, and the armies don't have to fight. And heck, we can fly into the water, or over the water, and we can get rid of the Navy too. So let's just have all of the Defense Department go and spend their money on the Air Force. And gee whiz, if it's going to be an Air Force, it should be independent too. Can you see why this might cause some problem with, say, the Army, the Navy, the Marines? You can see why there'd be political opposition to them. There's also a problem, and that is the prophets talked about the possibility of what could be done long before the technology made it happen. So Billy Mitchell was really famous. He decided to prove that he could sink ships. So he got a captured German battleship from World War I and anchored it off the coast of the Carolinas and had a bunch of bombers fly over, and the bombers dropped their bombs and the ship sank. And he said, see, we can sink ships. And the Navy said, okay, that's fine. That makes perfect sense. But if you have a nice sunny day and you anchor the ship with no crew in shallow waters and turn off its engine so it's not running around so it's easy to hit, and you only do it on a clear day when the winds aren't too bad, and there's nobody shooting back at you, and there's nobody on the ships to put out fires and do repairs and everything, yeah, you can probably sink the ship. But what did you really prove? Well, I can prove that you just need to buy airplanes instead of buying ships. And you can see why that makes people mad. And that was one of the many problems that Billy Mitchell got involved with. For better or for worse, many of the leaders in the United States Army Signal Corps bought into the ideas of Billy Mitchell, and in the 1920s and 1930s became the United States Army Air Corps. And it became semi-independent. And a lot of the money and a lot of the research went into making bombers. The most famous of those, of course, was the very famous Flying Fortress B-17. There we are. There's a photograph of it. You can see it's got 4 engines. If you count them, there's actually like 13 machine guns on the proper version of the B-17. It was designed to have a range of 2,000 miles, so you could fly to a target, drop your bombs, and then fly back. Ultimately, you could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs, or roughly 4 tons of bombs, to like 600 miles, or at full range, you could have like 2 tons. So you begin to see that the longer the range you're flying, the less bombs you can carry. And the idea is you're going to fly in a group of bombers, and every bomber has a bunch of machine guns. That's why we're going to call them the Flying Fortress. It'll raise money for us. It sounds really cool. And nobody would be smart enough or dangerous enough to actually stop these bombers. Well, of course, at the same time, there were lots of flyers all around the world who said, yeah, but if you have a small plane and it has a big engine, it can fly faster than the bombers. And if you organize them right, they might be able to shoot down the bombers. In America, the guy that was really famous for that was a renegade Louisiana man by the name of Claire Chanel, and you'll hear him a little bit later as the commander of the Flying Tigers. But there were people in Germany and in Britain and in France and other places who also put a lot of effort into making fighter planes. When Hitler came to power in Germany, the German Air Force was created. It was called the Luftwaffe. And the head of the Luftwaffe said, well, let's go ahead and build an Air Force. But he was a lot more concerned about coordinating the Luftwaffe with the ground troops. So while the Germans talked about control of the air, that is, sweeping all the enemy planes out of the air, they were focused also on supporting the army as it would attack, acting as, at some point, what was sometimes referred to as flying artillery. So, in 1939, in September 1939, when World War II began, the Germans pulled out of their back pockets their plans, which was, let's sweep the Polish forces out of the air, and what we're going to do with the British and the French when we attack them. We'll bomb all their airfields. They can't get their airplanes up. We'll then support our tanks. We'll also act as reconnaissance, so our tanks know where the enemy is, and then we can push through their lines and cause things. The action happened so fast, newspaper reporters in the West began to refer to this new German technology as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It's term that the Germans didn't actually use much. It showed up in a couple of books, but nobody really talked about it much. But it got big press in America. And once France fell and the Germans started attacking Britain, they began the so-called Battle of Britain. And the Germans began to run into some problems. They planned to have an air force that could give them air supremacy, but what if the enemy has a really strong defensive system? And it turns out that's one of the things the British had invested in between the wars. They'd been bombed by the Germans in World War I, and they didn't want to be bombed again. So unlike many other nations, they put a lot of effort into coming up with fighter planes that would be effective, hence the Spitfire. But more importantly, they also invested in science. Now, I love science, I really do. I also love the origins of science. At one point in the 1920s, Robert Watson Watt, who was so involved in radar that everybody talks about him now, was given a commission by the government to find out how much electricity it would cost, or how much electricity would be needed to make a death beam that could raise 4 quarts of water to a temperature of 110 degrees. Now, if you think about that for a second, let's see, 4 pints of water, that's about the blood supply for an average human being. And if you aim that death beam at the human being, you've got his blood to boil, you die. So all you need to defend your airspace is have a whole bunch of death beams, Buck Rogers style. And he sat down and said, well, let's see. In order to do that in one airplane, you need like twice the power that London consumes in a given week. So that's probably not very practical. But on the other hand, while doing research on that, I did find you could actually get sounds coming from airplanes in the distance that show up as electronic beams, and we could actually build machines that would track them, what we call radar now. But the British did more than just design radar. The British Royal Air Force, which was an independent organization, also said, hey, let's coordinate things. If we have radar and we can see where the enemy's coming from, we could actually have a centralized location somewhere around London where all the information comes in, and then the defenders could vector all the fighter planes to where the bombers are going. Now that gives you an advantage. Before radar came around, what would happen is if you're going to protect your airfield, you have a couple airplanes that are just circling your airfield until they nearly run out of gas, and then they go down to the ground and then they come up. It's called combat air control. And all they do is they do circles around the airfield to protect the airfield. Well, if the Germans show up halfway through the time, they start running low on gasoline, and then everybody else has to come up into the air while the Germans are bombing. It's really a bad kind of organization. So how about we use radar so we can anticipate where the Germans are coming? And we get all the airplanes up in the air to maximum altitude before the Germans show up so they can dive on the German airplanes. And in the meanwhile, what the Germans have done by flying from France is they've used up a bunch of their gasoline. And it turns out the Germans hadn't really been too interested in long-range bombing. So most of their bombers and all of their fighters had what the fighter pilots used to call short legs, which is to say that on average, German airplanes flying from airfields in France when they got to, say, London, would have about 10 minutes of airtime over London before they had to turn around and go home, or they'd fall out of the sky because they were out of gasoline. Now, you've got a whole bunch of Spitfires that just got up in the air, they're fully charged and fully filled with gasoline. They can fight for a lot longer than 10 minutes, right? The Germans are going to lose. Yep, Germans lost. Now, the Germans lost for a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons was the combined defensive techniques of the British linked with the radar gave them a real tactical advantage over the Germans. It's great, fine. The Germans get frustrated, they start losing too many bombers. The only thing they can do is attack when the British defenses aren't very effective. When the British fighter planes, for example, can't see the bombers. How do you do that? You attack only at night. And if you're attacking at night, you can't see the target very well, so you have to attack a big target like a city. And so the Germans switched from attacking British airfields and radar sites to bombing big cities in the hopes that Douhet was right, the vital centers, everybody would get so mad that they'd be bombed, they'd tell the government to stop fighting. And instead, of course, what happened is the Brits got really unhappy and had Winston Churchill cheering them on and so forth, and they said some sort of a hand gesture towards Hitler and an observation that we're going to fight you tooth and nail until you go home. So what happened is the profits of air supremacy through strategic bombing weren't really realistic about what they could offer. And the British defenses proved it. Now, once the Germans got involved in Russia, then the British are left with a problem. And that's the problem the Americans are going to get involved with too. And that is, while Germany is occupying most of Europe, how do we hurt the Germans? Now, for the Americans, we're still neutral. Remember that the war began in September of 1939, and it's not until after Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941, that the United States officially gets involved in the war. So up to that point, America as a neutral nation is doing a number of things, one of which is selling a lot of munitions and so forth to the British and French, and once the French had surrendered to the British. But also trying to coordinate quietly with the British how to be effective allies if we ever get involved in the war. So the British, for example, in the late 1930s, created a British purchasing commission which would come to American companies and say, can you make something for us? And one of the first things they thought about was, well, the Germans have introduced this new fighter plane called the Messerschmitt 109. It's very short, it's very small, it's very maneuverable, it has some good firepower, and it's really hard to stop. Now, it doesn't have very much range on it, but we really like the idea of it. So they come to America to have the Americans design an airplane like that. And the American company that does that is the North American Aeroplane Company, North American, which had been building the AT-6 Texan, the advanced training airplane, which is relatively small and relatively nimble. And they looked at the Messerschmitt 109 and said, let's design something similar to that. That is the origins of the P-51. Now, the original design was an American-built engine, an Allison engine, which was essentially a V12 engine. So we'll talk more about the differences of engine types here in a moment. But keep in mind, they start with an American engine, and it isn't that very powerful, and more importantly, at about 15,000 feet, it starts sucking wind because it doesn't really work very well at higher altitudes. So one of the realities of airplanes is the higher the altitude, the thinner the air. We all know that. But for an airplane engine to run very effectively, most airplanes are really effective up to 12 to 15,000 feet. Beyond that, they have a hard time. And people had introduced a supercharger yet as a way to inject more air into the engine so that even with thinner air, you still have the same power. So the original Mustang was tested by the Americans in 1940. The British purchased a few of them, but they were very anemic, and so they weren't used very much. And it wasn't really until 1941 the British said, hey, we've got this really great engine that we've been putting in our Spitfires. It's called the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Again, it's a V12 engine, but it's supercharged and it's very powerful. And some agreements were made back and forth, and it turns out that when you put the supercharger in the P-51, it becomes a lot faster and it can go to higher altitudes. So it goes from being an airplane that operates best in the area of about 14,000 to 18,000 feet to operating best in about 35,000 feet. That gives you a couple of advantages. First of all, you can go up to whatever altitude the bombers go to, and you can also get above the bombers and dive down on them and be more effective as a fighter plane. At the same time, of course, the Americans were looking at airplanes, and they're going, okay, we have our Curtiss P-40s, the Tomahawks that everybody's familiar with from flying fighters. These are good airplanes right now, but they're probably going to get obsolete fairly quickly, so let's do some designing. And the Republic Aviation Company started taking a design from a plane that they had been building in the 1930s called the P-35 and giving it a radial engine which might have a little bit more power. So what's the difference between a radial engine and a inline engine? So here's a picture of our engine, which is the Pratt & Whitney radial engine. So what you have is, here's your drive shaft, and then your cylinders are arranged around it. This one actually has 18 cylinders, 9 in the first ring and 9 behind it. As each piston goes along, what they're turning is actually the propeller shaft. Now you have a very big engine, and it's going to take a lot of air to keep it cooled down. And it's also very heavy. So you'll end up having to have a very big airplane. That's the genesis of the P-47. And if you look at the P-47 in the previous photo, you can see how large it is. And you see this huge cowling here, which is what it takes to accommodate the radial engine that you see behind you on the floor. Now, what the designers decided to do is build a big airplane, including a long fuselage, give it a lot of firepower, and realize that it's not going to be able to fly for long distances because the problem with radial engines is they suck a lot of gasoline down. The other thing is, the radial engine, if it's supercharged, which in fact it was, could also go to higher altitudes. And in fact, the service ceiling for the P-47 was 39,000 feet. And they ended up with an airplane that could do 424 miles an hour at 39,000 feet. They also put 850 caliber machine guns in the airplane. Now to start with, I guess we kind of ought to talk about the Germans. That Messerschmitt 109 starts out firing German 8mm ammunition out of their machine guns. We said, we really want to do a little bit more damage, so instead of using 8mm, we're going to use 50 caliber ammunition. You'll notice it's a little bit bigger and a little bit more powerful. It's going to do a lot more damage. When the Germans started running into American-made planes firing the 50 cals, then they had to upgrade to the 20mm, which was actually a shell that had small explosive content in it. So you could actually have exploding shells and they would do more damage, and it would also be a slower rate of fire. So you're beginning to see in World War II a technological race from this machine gun to this machine gun to this cannon. So think about that when you're reading the description. And the other thing is, with 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, we've got 4 50 calibers in each wing. The velocity of the 50 caliber bullets, which were designed to be armor piercing to start with, was so high that if you flew perpendicular to a train and fired all 8 machine guns at the same time and hit the engine, you could actually knock the engine off the track. That's real firepower. And if you're shooting at it in an enemy airplane and all it's got is aluminum skin, guess what that 50 calibers are going to be doing? They're going to go right through it. Now the problem, of course, is you make really nice holes in the aluminum, but the planes still fly. So now you have to start choosing what you're going to shoot at. But this is the introduction of the P-47. And by 1942, we were beginning to get training with the P-47s. And when the combined bomber offensive begins after the Americans and British have cleared North Africa, our first fighter planes of any real note were the P-47s. And they'd be flown until the end of the war. Now, the disadvantage, of course, is, like I said, they suck gasoline to nobody's business. They actually had a gas tank of around 200 gallons. And that was enough to take them from England to about where Paris is and then back again. Now, if you're going to try to bomb the German factories in, say, the Ruhr or central Germany, or God, even worse, in Berlin, P-47s aren't going to get far enough, which means what we're going to do is we're going to camp. Bill Mitchell had to be right. The bomber will always get through. And in 1943, we flew a whole series of big actions where we were trying to destroy major German industrial centers, like Schweinfurt, where they made ball bearings, which all engines need. And we had a problem. On the Schweinfurt raids, we were averaging 20% losses. Okay, so if you have 100 airplanes, and you fly them over Schweinfurt, and you fly them back, you end up with 20 airplanes that are either shot down or so badly damaged they can't fly again. So that's 1/5 of your force. Now, when the Americans began the combined bomber operations, we determined that we wanted to fly only during the daylight so we could see targets and bomb them very accurately. And then we told the pilots and the aircrew, you have to fly 25 missions before your term of service is over and you rotate home to train new pilots. So every time you fly a mission, there's a 20% chance of being shot down. What are the chances of making it through 25 missions? Statistics are a really ugly beast. So that's a problem. And so what begins to happen is in 1943, the Americans make big efforts to try to fly unescorted bombers over Germany so they could bomb the German industrial planes. Not to bomb cities per se, but to bomb factories and railroad yards and gasoline supplies and gasoline fields and things like that. The average missions were running about 5 to 7% losses. The really deep missions like to Schweinfurt or worse yet to Berlin, they're running about 15 to 20%. And you're going to run out of pilots and airplanes really fast that way. So there's a problem. The problem is the Germans are not stupid. They had the ability to learn from what the British had done. So, how did the Germans respond to these? First of all, they had known about radar too. They just hadn't thought about combining radar with coordination. Then the British said, hey, that's a good idea. So the first thing they did is they created a network in occupied Europe of radar that could very easily identify when the bomber stream started coming towards them. And then they would send out swarms of fighters at intervals so that as you cross the English Channel, you'd run into one group of German fighters. And when they started running out of gasoline, you'd run into the next group of German fighters, and the next group of German fighters, the next group of German fighters. By the time you get to the target, then the German anti-aircraft guns would start off on shooting at you. So you've got a problem there. Now, what those anti-aircraft guns are firing predominantly for the higher range bombers are 88 millimeter projectiles, which this is one of them. So when they talk about the German 88, that's what it's shooting. If you look at it, you'll see there's a little reservoir in the middle. That's where the explosive compound is going to go. This weighs 21 pounds, of which about 4 pounds is actually high explosive content. And when it blows up in midair, what you get is a bunch of what they call shrapnel, which is one of the best if I turn it right. Here we are. I have a piece of shrapnel. This is from land use, but shrapnel is shrapnel, gives you an idea. When that shell explodes, all the metal shards go flying through the air. And somewhere between about 10 feet to 20 feet from where the explosion is, these things are flying fast enough to tear holes through airplanes or anybody inside the airplanes. So what you do is if you've got a German anti-aircraft gun, it's not by itself. German anti-aircraft guns are always with what they call batteries, which are usually 4 to 6 guns. And they all set themselves up. Radar tells them the airplanes are coming in such and such a direction at such and such an altitude. You set the fuses on the shell so they explode at that altitude, and then all 6 guns start firing at once. This is a pretty big shell. The 88 that fired it, if you want to see what one of these looks like, by the way, go up to the Indiana Military Museum. There is an 88 millimeter anti-aircraft gun up there, so you can actually look at one of those and see. They fire between 12 and 15 rounds per minute. Now imagine 6 of those firing, say 10 rounds a minute. I could do the mathematics. That's 60 rounds per minute at the right altitude, all of them firing shells that are exploding. Oh boy, that's a problem. And the other thing is, the bombers, they're really good. The B-17s are really strong, but when you come to your target, you have to drop your bomb so that it lands on the target, which means you have to fly in a straight line without moving around, because if you move around, the bomb goes somewhere where it's not supposed to. And the Germans know where their cities are. So if you're on the right vector to go to, say, Bremerhaven or Hamburg or whatever, they know where you're coming from. They know where the big plants are. So they can set up the anti-aircraft gun so you have a whole series of batteries firing at you. And as you come in, there's nothing you can do. You have to fly upon the straight and narrow. Now, the American B-17 had what was called the Norden bomb sight. What made the Norden bomb sight really effective was not the optics so much, but there was actually an internal mechanism that made it into the autopilot of the bomber. As it closed in on target, the pilot would release controls, and the navigator would use the Norden bomb sight for the final controls to make sure that the bomb would be dropped the exact second it needed to be dropped, so that as it fell to Earth, it would land on target. Now, imagine not just 1 plane or 2 planes or 5 planes, but how about a bombing range with 100 planes or 200 planes? First guys, they can see the target, they can drop the bombs, right? 3rd or 4th planes back, you're already seeing explosions. How carefully are you aiming things? Well, that's a problem. Okay, another problem. You can look at pictures here of the Republic plant. The Republic plant is a pretty typical plant for making airplanes. Okay, if you drop a bomb on the Republic plant, are you going to destroy the plant? Are you going to destroy the building? Well, if you look at it, there's a whole bunch of railroad rails for each set of workstations, right? And there's a bunch of spare parts, and there's a bunch of machines like milling machines and stuff, which are big pieces of steel. Unless the bomb drops directly on that piece of steel, it's not going to do much. Shrapnel is clean, you're going to clean off the shrapnel, and it's going to be operating. So the problem that Billy Mitchell and the other prophets didn't think about is you can drop bombs on a plant. You can scare off a bunch of people, you can kill some of the workers, and in 2 or 3 days it can get back in operation. So even if you muster 500 or 600 airplanes to drop bombs on a city, how soon do you have to go back to drop it again to make sure the Germans don't get back to production again? So it isn't like you can just bomb one city and then fighting right there, they go to another one. And then think about a country the size of, say, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and Minnesota. That's like 3 times the size of Germany. You get the idea. How many big cities are there? And how many cities have how many factories? And how many of those are you going to have to repeat bomb week after week after week? You can see that there's going to be a problem, especially if the Germans, like the British, respond to being bombed by being fairly hostile, because you're blowing up their homes. So what do? Now, there's some other issues involved in trying to destroy the enemy by bombing. So, first thing is we've got the organized integrated air defense system with the radar, with the waves of fighters, and of course with the radar, they're freshly filled with gasoline and ammunition, and they're at maximum altitude so they can keep diving on the bombers, which makes it that much harder for the gunners. Then, there's passive defenses. First of all, you got civil defense firefighters, bomb shelters, air raid warnings, and so forth. So as the airplanes come in, everybody scuttles into the bomb shelters, waits till they're gone, when they come out of bomb shelters, they go back to work. Now, there's other things you can do. The Germans came up with the idea of bombing at night, right? So how do you make sure that they don't bomb the right cities? Well, the Germans came up with this idea. Set out a whole bunch of street lights in the middle of the field. And at night, you turn those lights on, and the navigators see this field over here, which is only a couple miles off of where the city is. Let's bomb that field. Let's miss the city entirely. If they're coming over during the daylight like the Americans, get a whole bunch of smoke generators and start getting the smoke going across in front of the area that's going to be bombed. And the bombing isn't going to be very accurate. Oh, by the way, since the Germans are occupying most of occupied Europe, if you kill too many workers, they can just start enslaving workers. So you get work being done by concentration camp inmates, Eastern Europeans from Russia and Poland and Belarus and Ukraine and so forth that are being sent to Germany as slave laborers. Oh, hey, we can also put factories in different locations that are harder to see since they're only assembled at the last moment, and some of those we can even put in caves. How are you going to bomb those? Oh, well, you're going to have to bomb them again and again and again. You could begin to see the problem that you have with strategic bombing. The other issue that's in some ways even more pernicious is the United States in particular tries to come up with an idea of what to bomb. Do you bomb the enemy airfields? Do you bomb the enemy factories? Do you bomb the enemy lines of communication, their railroads? Do you bomb their political structures? Or do you bomb where the people live? The British, of course, who've learned their lessons during the Battle of Britain, only attacked the German cities at night. And you know how we use words sometimes to camouflage things? The British were just as good as the Germans were with that. So the Germans have the Endlösung, the final solution to the Jewish problem, they said. Well, the British solution to German industrial growth is let's dehouse the workers. Dehouse. What happens when you dehouse? You just simply ask the people to leave their homes? Well, what dehousing really means is don't try to find factories at all. Find the population areas of the cities and bomb the hell out of them and blow up all the homes. People can't go back to their homes. They're going to have to live somewhere else, and they're going to have to be trucked into the city. And their morale may suffer if they're living in a tent somewhere outside the city. So dehousing is the sort of political way of saying, let's just raise the city. And if you think about the images you've seen of German cities at the end of World War II, you can see how that translates into what was happening. So there's a whole lot involved in trying to destroy the enemy. And as I said, we also have the tyranny of statistics, how many of the American air crew and British air crew, for that fact, are dying in action. The reality is that the efforts in 1943 to have successful strategic bombing weren't successful, and the statistics were telling the Americans this. So the only solution is you need to find planes that can escort the bombers and keep the enemy fighters away from the bombers. And it worked for a while for the raids going into France, and that's where the P-47 really comes into its own. Now, how do you fly further than you have enough gas for? One of the first solutions is to have what they call drop tanks. This is very ingenuity at its best. So you got an airplane, and underneath you have a big, what looks like a giant teardrop. That's actually a container filled with gasoline. And when you fly, you suck the gasoline out of that first, and then when it's empty, you drop it. Now, I love American technology. You know what those were made out of? They look like metal, right? You've seen photos of them? They're actually made out of paper mache with a lacquer over it. Because you can fill them up with gasoline, and it takes 4 or 5 hours for the gasoline to eat through the paper mache. By which time you float over the target, You drop the drop tanks, they fall to the ground and occupy dirt, but what do they do when they hit the ground? They smash because they're just paper mache. So the church have all this paper mache scattered all over everywhere that they can't reuse. Eventually, you're going to see the P-51s use the drop tanks too. With drop tanks, the P-47s could go not only to Paris, but all the way to the Rhine River, which is basically the western boundary of Germany. By this point, the P-51 had been introduced using the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. So let's talk about that just very briefly here. We've got the Pratt & Whitney radial engine. Here's the P-51. You can notice when you look at it how much cleaner the lines are. You'll also find out that the P-51 had some interesting handling characteristics. It was not as stable as the P-47. And then the engine that the P-51 used was, as I said, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. And unfortunately, the circle kind of covers that up. But you see, it's a standard V12 engine where each of the cylinders is an angle, and when it runs, that turns the propeller shaft. The difference between this and the Wasp radial, though, is this is water cooled. So you have a radiator essentially on top of or below the engine that provides cool water so the engine keeps running. Now, for air-to-air combat, these inline V12 engines are really great. They're the cat's meow because they're smaller. They have a much less coefficient of drag. So what is coefficient of drag? The bigger the airplane, the more power you need to push that big, huge airplane like the P-47 through the air, which means it sucks up a lot of gasoline because it's overcoming a lot of drag. P-51 is a much narrower, let's look back at it, and much more aerodynamic look, which means it can go faster with the engine. All right. So with that, you'll see that the engine will give you a lot of power, and you have a lot of maneuverability like the German Messerschmitt. However, the original engine, like I said, was relatively low power. With the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, they could go up to 40,000 feet. And with 2 drop tanks, they could actually, because they had better mileage, make it all the way to Berlin and back. So from early 1944 till the end of the war, P-51s were used primarily for missions into Germany, over Steinfurt, over Berlin, and so forth, that protected the bombers. So what do you do with the P-47s? That's the same time window where we've landed at Normandy, and the realization is, hey, we can use the P-47s for ground attack role. And again, the difference is, if we go back a little bit and we look at the radial engine, you'll notice that there's no radiator attached to it. Instead, what happens is each cylinder head is shaped to draw air past it as a way to cool the engine, so that there's no radiator. If you're flying ground attack, which means you're flying low and the enemy's shooting at you a lot, if they put a hole in your radiator, what happens? You lose water and you fall out of the sky. And this is where the German 20mm anti-aircraft guns that fire 500 rounds a minute, or 450 rounds a minute, become a real danger. You see a lot of pictures of those being used in the Normandy campaign later in the war. With the radial engine, the P-47s could keep flying. With the Merlin engine, the P-51s could not. Any kind of damage to the radiator and the plane has to go home when they fall out of the sky. So what happens is you end up having P-47s still flying, still being maneuverable, still being capable of dogfighting when they get a chance. But instead what they're now doing is doing ground attacks. The other thing that happens is, as we start bombing more and more cities, the Germans withdraw their fighter planes to where those cities are, and when the only way to destroy the Luftwaffe is a set of orders by Jimmy Doolittle to have the American pilots send bomber streams to the big German cities with lots and lots of fighter planes as escorts, so that when the Germans come up, you can shoot down more German fighter planes. And by the middle of the war, the German Luftwaffe has been broken. The statistic for that is D-Day itself. On D-Day, the Americans and British had almost 7,000 airplanes in the air, and they had 120,000 sorties flown on June the 6th. The Germans had 80 airborne, air-capable airplanes, and they flew 260 sorties on the same day. So, how much do you think those 260 sorties slowed down the Americans? Very little. So what you begin to see is that now we're using bombers as bait to bring up the German fighters and destroy them down. Now, I am beginning to run out of time, so I just want to go back to the first idea I talked about, and that is, as you can see with the fighters being used both on the ground and in the air, they protected the bombers could get through, but they also started to affect the ability of the Germans to move on the ground. And at that point, you have that synergy that the team creates. You have the ability to hurt the Germans in many ways. So that's a wrap. Again, it wasn't the goat that won the war, it was the teamwork. And with that, I'd like to answer any questions anybody might have. Any questions out there? That'd be great.
I have a comment.
Okay.
I learned something recently about Alexander Cartvelli, who was the guy that signed the T-47 as a follow-on to the T-43, which was built by the Seversky aircraft company. He was also Russian.
Right.
Cartvelli learned to fly during World War II and came to the United States in the between-war period to work as both a flight instructor and a consultant to the United States Signal Corps at that time, which is what flew most of the airplanes. And it was right after that he got into design and so forth. So he came here as a consultant and he essentially never went back. His family was quite wealthy. They had money, and obviously his life probably would have been in danger if he had returned to the Soviet Union.
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct. And Seversky had also come from what later became the Soviet Union, and both of them were very successful in designing. Seversky did a lot of designs of helicopters later. And so you're exactly correct. There's a lot of people that were involved in the designs, and that's one of the advantages we have. Any other
I think we
questions?
can take maybe just one more. Sorry, we're going to be running close. You ready?
Yeah. It might be interesting to know that although the Rolls-Royce Merlin was English built, the vast majority of B-51s used Packard engines built under license.
That is exactly correct. You are absolutely right, and that was one of the things I had intended to talk about. Packard actually had to work in conjunction with Rolls-Royce to get the ability to make them. And the Packard engines were built on the Rolls-Royce design. So absolutely right.
Okay, how about that? Listen, if you ever want to hear more, there's more. But I'm sure we'll have you again. And, really appreciate it. Thank you all.
If anybody has other questions, you can come up and ask me.
Hey, here's one thing. We are looking for a riveter. Do we have a woman on the premises who has either experience or knows about being a riveter? We heard, there was a rumor that there might be someone here who may have done that in a past life.
And if that person is here, if they could go talk to the lady manning the front desk, that'd be great, because she had some questions to ask me.
Thank you for finishing my thought. He is so smart. Listen, we appreciate it. Honored and humbled. Please come back. Take care of yourself. Thank you.